Are you in the room?
Yeah.
Okay.
What's up?
Hey, welcome back.
Hey, man. It's good to hear from you.
Yeah.
It's been a long
You
time.
look totally different.
Do I really?
Yeah. Wardrobe change.
Yeah.
Hats backwards.
Totally. I didn't have a hat. So this is a
is that what it was?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you knew that. It's a totally different day.
Yeah.
Totally different
4 minutes later.
exercise.
What had happened was Cory got to write on the Post-it pad. Welcome, Post-it pad. Thanks for having me. And I got jealous.
For those of you audio listeners only, there is a third screen that says Post-it pad. All right. Continue.
I wanted to draw on the Post-it pad.
Totally.
Do you have a marker? I do have a marker. So we are in this kind of 2-week series within a series.
A little hiatus, a little break.
Yeah. So we had been in this long run exploring 248's 15 observations in urban disciple-making movements. We had to push a couple of interviews back. So we're inserting a couple of, this is like training podcasts.
Yeah.
Stuff we talk about.
Things you can insert in if you're training people, or you just really, a lot of the training happens just on everyday one-offs. So you're having a conversation with someone who's also living like a missionary. It's like, here's a good thing to either one-on-one or within a group.
Yeah. So this time we're going to talk about the relational circles of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean by that?
I do. Yeah, I do. And I'm excited to hear more about it. I'm excited because this is not a tool that's in our missionary pathway, but it's a tool that comes up all the time in other trainings and settings. I know, Brian, you do this a lot with leaders, but super, super practical.
Yep.
For those of us who are like beginning that, like, hey, I think God has called me to this group of people or this context. And how do I even kind of relationally get started? So it's almost like a tool inserted into the missionary pathway. After the first one, that's like extraordinary prayer and fasting. And second one, we say live as a missionary, like identify yourself as a disciple-making missionary. Okay, so relationally, what does that look like? This tool is inserted right there.
Yeah. We first started using this tool back when we were at Westside, when we were training everyday leaders, like, how do you order your relational world like Jesus? Like, Jesus seems to be the genius at everything. I shouldn't say he seems to be. He is the genius at everything.
That's one of my favorite Dallas Willard things. Used to always say he was the most brilliant. Yeah, he's
the most brilliant man.
Most brilliant man in like pretty much every subject. We underestimate Jesus' brilliance.
Yes. Yeah. So we're training people in this. I think I first started exploring these ideas maybe back in like 2009, 2010, reading a book called The Search to Belong by Joseph Myers. You can check that one out. And then Alex Absalom and some other guy, I think Bobby Harrington, wrote a book called Discipleship That Fits. So this tool is all about ordering your relational world like Jesus. And you can find it on our toolkit, actually. So if you go to kzunderground.org/toolkit, you can sign up. And then a lot of the tools that we look at are found there. And we're trying to add those. So
it's good. Yeah, just a note on the toolkit, because we have so many tools. The idea is not that you go and replicate 1,000 tools. The idea is that for coaching relationships and training and just like in real time, we just have these little things that have been helpful for either us or lots of people we run with. Like, hey, so a lot of times these come up in coaching groups.
Yeah.
Like a group might be stuck in how do I actually begin to have spiritual conversations, identify people? Hey, here's a really good tool. So anyway, like that's just, so this is inserted in that, but there's a lot of really good, really practical tools. The expectation is not that you know all 100 tools, but in real time, you need something. We hope to have something that can help you.
Just in time training is usually what we talk about.
Yep.
So Cory, to start this one off, you get to be the audience on this one. When you think about how a lot of people live, it's often very segmented, right? Like their relational worlds don't overlap. What are the different contexts in which we tend to live?
Yeah. Where we work, kind of our working environment, our neighbors, where we live, if we have, like hobbies, so where we play, if there's other passions in life, like, where we kind of like serve, or I don't know, one way of thinking about it. A lot of it's online too. I think that's one that we don't talk about enough, like our relational networks online. So those are 4 big ones that pop in my mind.
If you have kids, all the stuff that fits in their world.
Yeah.
Right?
So all of those things, but our kids'
Yeah. Like,
circles.
so I have
Yep.
my hobbies and places where I show up, but my kids also might have sports things that they're showing up to now. And so this is going to be really small on the screen, but we usually start trying to create like a little bit of tension to go, I've got these different boxes in which I live. And oftentimes these boxes, like they're segmented and they don't overlap at all. So I go to work, I see some people there. I do this hobby here. I got the sports thing here. If you're in the church world, you might have a church thing.
Mm-hmm.
That the neighborhood doesn't overlap with that.
Yep.
Right. So that's kind of the beginning point. That's weird, jumping back.
Hey, welcome back, Brian. You're also much louder now because the microphone is right in your face. So,
okay.
No, that was really good. Thank you, Post-it note microphone.
Yeah, well done, Post-it pad. Yeah. So the idea is to like stir a little tension with people to go, if your relational worlds don't overlap, like, and you want to live a more integrated life to be more effective as a disciple maker, then we need to live like Jesus lived. Mm-hmm. Disciples of Jesus need to follow Jesus in relationships. So how did Jesus do it? There's 4. I get my hand in there. If you're watching this, if you're not, it doesn't matter. There's 4 kind of primary spaces where Jesus does his life. So I prepped Cory a little bit. What's the first one?
First one would be the crowds. So that picture we got in the scripture would be like the 72.
Well, that's the second.
That's the second one.
Yeah.
That's what I meant to say.
Oh, okay.
My bad. Yeah. The crowds of people are the first one, just the talking to the lots and lots of people. The second one was the 72, right? And you'll probably dive deeper into that. But
yeah, I'll go back into
we see that in Luke chapter 10, right? The next would be, the 12, his disciples that were invited. And the last would be the 3. You got the Peter, James, and John triad there.
And then there's a tiny little one at the bottom that's like just Jesus and his Father. So this one isn't included in the search to belong. It's not included. I don't know if it's included in discipleship that fits, but it's one that we've added.
I like that. Yeah, that little one bullseye there.
Yeah, Jesus has this divine space where it's just him and his Father, and he's asking, where are you at work? How can I join you? What are you saying so that I should be saying it? Like that. That's how he orders.
And the very sentness of that. I was actually in John 8 this morning and saw Jesus talks about how the Father sent him. It's like 4 or 5 times just in that chapter alone. So the sentness of Jesus coming from the Father really fuels all this. Yeah. So when you're looking at this, gut reactions on the difference between sort of this not integrated, I live in all these different relational spaces, to this concentric circles that we see here. Like, yeah. I mean, the first thing that the tension is like, well, I don't have personally enough relational capacity to think this way in all those boxes, right? So that's part of it. The being over segmented makes it so I'm scattered. I can't even begin to intentionally move towards the middle, like move towards the center of those. So that's the first one that jumps out to me, is that it's very personal as well. Because I think a lot of people sit in that in our context, right? Like we're scattered about, and we don't actually have, maybe the second thing is we don't have any sort of intentional middle relationships. You can be in the crowds all the time. Yeah. You can be online and be in the crowds all the time. The 72 even is hard to find. Like, so there's just a lot of loneliness and very little intentionality going deeper. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and pull up Luke chapter 6, verse 12. Yeah. Just Luke 6 Luke 6, 12 and 13, but don't read that yet. So I'm just going to go through the crowds and the 72. I'm going to ask you to read it in a minute. I want to look at it.
Calm down.
I'm just looking at it. I just want people to know.
All right. So
I'm ready.
As Cory mentioned at the top, this tool is all about helping people that have begun to identify a space. And they're thinking like, all right, how can I be most effective in this space? How can my life be fully integrated so I can give my best time to the right spaces? And then how do I get to that space where I know my 12 and I know my 3? I'm going to say it seems, based on my reading of scripture and what I see Jesus do and the way that I think sort of this flows out, I'm sure there would be people that have spent much more time studying scripture that would argue this point, but this is what it seems like. It seems like Jesus begins up here in the crowds. As he begins his ministry, he's moving around. He's got these big spaces where he's teaching. There's 5,000, there's 4,000. He's standing, on the shore, and all these people show up. Early on in his journey, maybe you can think of some of these stories too. Like Jesus is healing people in a village all night, right? Like it says, like the entire village shows up basically, and they're bringing their sick to him. And so Jesus has these spaces where he's just constantly with the crowds. And it's in these spaces where he's demonstrating the kingdom, he's proclaiming the kingdom, but he's teaching in parables. Not everybody's exactly sure what he's saying. And in the search to belong, Joseph Myers makes this point that we all have this need in our souls to belong in a space like this. We all have this need to like have some sense of identity with the crowds. Sports analogies are our thing.
Yeah.
Because we're two dudes sitting in here, and we always talk about like
sports,
football, right?
Sports, football.
Like this is a helpful sort of metaphor. Like you can be in a stadium somewhere watching your favorite team. They score a touchdown. You can high five and hug the person next to you and not even know their name. But you're like, we're together, right? Like me and you, we're Chiefs fans. Right. Well, neither one of us really
Ironically, neither of us are in Kansas City, but that's all right. Most of the people around us are.
Yeah, so it's like we have that need to belong there. Anything else come to mind with the crowds before I go to 72?
Man, you nailed it. No, I'm just nodding along. That's good.
Yeah. So again, thinking through that lens of like, how can I be effective? What do we do in the crowd space? Like just pick a neighborhood space. Like what makes sense to do to begin to engage the crowd?
Yeah. So, man, it was recently 4th of July. So send out a message to the whole neighborhood about a little 4th of July potluck thing on our street.
Yeah. So parties.
Throw some parties, baby. Become a event organizer. I mean, it's funny to say because we don't program people, but that tends to be, we become a relational catalyst, like spark for people. Give people an excuse to be friends with one another in some capacity.
Yeah. When we're beginning to enter into a new context, we have to get to know people. What's the best way to do that? Throw parties. And you don't have to like consider this like 80 people have to show up every time. And the cool thing about this tool is we can begin to think how this intersects with other tools. What if you're super introverted on the scales and like that idea of throwing parties is like, what's the tool that comes to mind to think through who can help me do this?
A tool? You just talking about context map? Or you talking
person of peace?
Oh, person of peace. Yes, the idea of person of peace. You find in someone else. Maybe there's somebody else who, I mean, they may not know Jesus yet, but they're going to be the relational connector, right? That's that traditional understanding of personal peace. Person of peace. They open the doors for other relationships. You also, I mean, you can be crowd, but you can be on a smaller level. So even if it's, you're still functioning on the more like wide part of the funnel. But creating other spaces where you're not quite, it doesn't mean you just have to be this extroverted machine out there, going from person to person, but some intentionality of getting a couple families together, or, what we have done, cigars on the back porch, whatever, happy hour, fire pits. That's a huge one in neighborhood settings. And then different, we're doing a lot of neighborhood setting type of things, but I mean, you just translate that into whatever else.
Creating whatever settings. Context,
like I was like create settings where relationships can happen because of the world that we live in. Now, the reason why we're even having this conversation, that there's so much loneliness. So one of the best missional practices for any disciple maker in any kind of urban or city, suburban, whatever setting, is to create space that relationships can happen.
And there's not a depth at this level that's like everybody has to open up and tell their deepest, darkest secret. The point, and I love the way you said that too. It's like, it might be like, it might be 2 or 3 families. It's not 80 people or whatever. But the point is like, it's just a low pressure environment where we can just hang.
No, that's so good. It's like the crowds doesn't straight up mean numbers.
Yeah, it doesn't mean, yeah.
Yeah, it's more setting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So within that setting, there's friendship. There's place for intentional conversations. Obviously, like that happens anywhere and everywhere. But you're not expecting at that moment to do a DBS, with the crowd, right? You're not like, you are getting to know people. You're like you got your spiritual eyes open to see where God's at work. But it is, less about just, okay, I have to have 30 people there. It's more about the setting is going to be open for early relationship building, trust, conversations. So when we'll talk about the different types of conversations, like casual, meaningful, spiritual, and then like invite into discovery and discipleship conversations. These are a lot of, casual conversations.
Yeah.
Maybe meaningful or spiritual questions that are asked, but your expectation or hope is to create relationships.
And it's in that environment that we're listening for, like, who's spiritually open.
Yep.
So it seems, again, this is my take, it seems like Jesus is moving from engaging the crowds. He's at the party. He makes the better wine. He's demonstrating the kingdom of God. He's healing the sick. He's casting out demons. People are like, man, have you heard about this Jesus guy? Like, we got to, like, let's go find him. Let's go be with him. And from that, there's this 72.
Yeah.
What do we know about the 72?
We know that the 72 were actually joining Jesus on mission. We see that in Luke chapter 10. We see that it was a little bit more intentionality. There were actually, they were his disciples, right? That's what that language in scripture actually called, 72 disciples that were sent out. Those are, two of the big things. It wasn't the 12, but it included the 12. Obviously 72 is a larger number. What else jumps out to me? What else do we know about the 72?
We only have 2 verses from them.
so I exhausted a lot of it. Yeah.
Yeah. We have like the beginning of Luke 10 and halfway through Luke 10. Mm-hmm. Jesus says, go into the next towns and villages, proclaim the kingdom, heal the sick. And then always like highlight on this one. We know they were close enough to Jesus that when he said that, they weren't like, whoa. Like, it just says they went and did it. And we know they went and did it because of the second verse where it says they came back and they're like, even the demons obeyed us. Like, so this isn't a door greeter job. Like, this is pretty big stuff that he gave them to do.
Yeah.
So they were in his relational world enough that they're watching him, that they felt confident enough to go, yeah, we'll go do that. And then they came back and they were celebrating it, right? So this is like the next relational circle in, where it's like, as we're thinking about the crowds that we've engaged, and, it depends on your context too. You might be a year into just throwing parties and getting to know people, right?
Yeah.
You're having these like casual conversations that are moving more spiritual, or meaningful to spiritual. And from that, you're like, Jesus, from these like crowds, who can really begin to join me? Be in my relational world.
Yep. Yeah. I think that I just want to reiterate what you just said. Like, in America, thinking about movement, making disciples, planting the gospel, we often want it to be fast. We train towards multiplicative things that wouldn't be the slowest thing ever. But the reality is that 72 or that crowd stage can take a while, and like, you build trust, and it doesn't have to, it doesn't always, but it can. Right. So, I think a year of throwing parties is not the craziest statement. I hope that's encouraging and not discouraging to you. So I just want to reiterate that first thing first, is that like, that can take some time. But over that time, if you really are living with intentionality, asking God, where at you work, how can I join you? This can come up relatively, naturally, smoothly, if you're just, having those intentional conversations, joining where he's at.
Again, going back to the sports metaphor, I always say, like, it's one thing to high five and hug your neighbor in the stadium. Yeah. You don't want to be like, hey, lost my job this week. That's not the environment for it, right? Yeah. Like, you can't go to that depth of relationship. Again, when we think about depth of relationship in the 72, it's like, this is more the tailgate. There's a whole bunch of people hanging out. Like, I have more relational connection in that environment with this place that I'm always at, that I can talk about something that happened that I might actually get some support in.
Yeah.
Like, people are like, oh, let's talk about that. I know somebody or whatever it is. Why don't you read Luke 6, 12 and 13?
I'd love to, Brian, because I'm ready. I've had this up and ready. All right, Luke 6, 12 and 13. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them whom he designated as apostles.
What stands out?
Man, it stands out is that it was clearly a bunch of people that were his disciples.
Probably the 72.
Probably the 72.
The 120,
there's
whatever.
There's more than 12.
Yeah.
And then he intentionally, after prayer, chooses 12 specific men, which is so interesting. These early chapters and these multiple different gospels is that you don't necessarily have a clear timeline always of choosing the 12. It's like all of our bold, summary points within scriptures, like Jesus chooses the first disciples. I think there's truth in that.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily he did this and this equaled this and then he had the 12 and then he did his ministry. Like it was, there was ministry. Jesus' ministry started and kind of weaved through these early relationships.
Totally.
So yeah, that's interesting. It's
not as clean as I'm trying to make it here,
but it's not as, but my point is more that it's not as clean on the other side. Often we just think he chose his 12.
Yeah. He chose
his 12 and they started going ministry, but there's clearly like relational dynamics that were bigger, from crowd to small to when he chose a couple that chose to follow him. But there was a moment when the 12 became the 12.
Yeah.
And there was like,
Yeah. And there's a designation of them as apostles. So that means something.
Yep.
But in this relational circle way, as we try to think through, like, I know my context, I'm going to start getting to know the crowds, getting to know as many people as possible, see who God is already at work among, begin to have these spiritual conversations, living among people that they can see my life and begin to go, I think you live differently. I'd like to be more a part of that. And then from that, like, there's an invitation into deeper disciple making that happens.
Yeah.
So on that one, like, it's, again, it seems to me, it says that he called Matthew to follow him, but maybe Matthew's a common name. Maybe he chose like 8 different Matthews to go, hey, come follow me and be my disciple. It's just, we have that one specific story because Matthew ended up being the apostle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other 8 Matthews didn't get their story written in, but they're there. They're just in a different relational. They're a little further out.
Were they all named Levi?
I don't know.
Okay. I just don't know where this starts and where this ends.
I'm going to go back to the sports metaphor on this one.
Perfect. I get you.
This one is like the team is out of town. The tailgate's not happening. I got my close friends watching the game at the house. Mm-hmm. And there's a depth of relationship that can happen here that can't happen over there at the tailgate. Like, now it's like I can talk about some other heavy thing. Like we're getting into more of life.
You can scream and cuss at like what Alabama football looks like post Nick Saban, and you can get really angry about it. But
don't distract me. We're trying to do a good tool.
I'm sorry, but they won't judge you. No, I hear you.
So, final sort of relational circle here. What do we know about the 3? What stands out from that?
There is depth of relationship. There is intentionality. There's experiences that only the 3 of them experienced alongside Jesus. There's a deep trust, like a next level, leaning on one another.
When we go back to that passage in Luke 16, it says that he invited Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James. I told you there were multiple names in there, right?
You're right.
Simon, there's another one. Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot. So those are the 12. But we don't hear a ton about Philip, Bartholomew, the other Simon. Like, their names are mentioned. I'm not saying they don't get brought up.
We don't know it.
But like routinely, it's Peter, James, and John.
Yep.
Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John get to join Jesus when he raises the little girl from the dead. Peter, James, and John get to go on the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter, James, and John get to go deeper in the garden. It would seem that there's a depth of relationship with these 3 that is like they're getting a little more access.
Yeah.
They're a little closer to, in fact, Jesus is on the cross and he looks at John and he's like, hey, see my mama? Let's take care of her.
Mm.
Like that's not an invitation to everyone else, you know? So anyway, this tool is helpful as we think through, like, it's not going to perfectly fix your relational world that's all segmented out here.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not designed, like, you still have to go to work. If that's not your context, you still have to go there. Right? Like, it's more about, like, when you're thinking about being effective as a disciple maker in that specific context,
Yes.
order your relational world like Jesus.
Yes.
And go, I got to get to know the crowds. From that, I can begin to have spiritual conversations to get, like, some people that would be more willing to join me in meaningful conversations that are moving to spiritual conversations, which is the 12. Like, no, I want to teach you. I'm going to call you to the side and explain what I meant by the sermon that I taught. And then from that, you know, like, if Chris were here, he'd say this is a Hesed space. There's a 3 to 5 space that we're developing this deeper relationship.
Right.
And then we all need that divine space with the Father.
Yeah. Something that I think is significant, and I want to try to be clear on this because it's popping in my brain, that I think sometimes we can try to make two kind of pathways, like separate this in our brain. And it's like, this is what we do with other believers. Like, this is one pathway.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is what we do on mission. And here's another relational pathway. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying this applies to both and that together. Mm-hmm. So let me say it like this. Like, I'm thinking if I'm with, you know, if you're coming from a super churched paradigm in your brain, you can use this understanding to be like, okay, I'm with the crowd of people.
Yeah, Sunday morning.
I'm on mission with a handful of others. And then, like, you go a little bit deeper with, well, but I've got my 3, like, I've got this community that has said space that you talked about earlier. I got these people I can trust, that I can go deep in the stuff, right? And that's true. 100% true. There's also this conversation of, and where we're using it in both ways. But specifically, this conversation has been around our mission spaces, right? Mm-hmm. We've identified that we are missionaries, disciple makers. We're out there. This is the context that God has called me. So now I'm thinking through the same relational journey, right? But I'm thinking in terms of new disciple making, gospel planting, starting more relationships, identifying a handful that lean in, identifying even more in spiritual conversations, and even more that we, like, pour into. Right. Yeah. Like, both of those things are true. Mm-hmm. I just think that, like, within this conversation, it's important to be able to, like, recognize that that's, we're leaning towards the mission conversation, but this is just as true on the already believer Christian community conversation as well. It's helpful for us to know maybe the way that Jesus ordered his relational life can really overlap in both of those ways.
Well, he lives at such, like, a centered, peaceful state. You know, like, he's not running from context to context. Mm-hmm. And it's helpful also as you think about this tool to go, like, you don't leave the crowds. You keep throwing parties. You don't leave the 72. You don't leave the 12 when you're with the 3. I mean, there are spaces where it's like, I'm just with the 3. But wherever Jesus was with the 3, the 12 are nearby. Mm-hmm. Clearly, when he's with the 72, the 3 and the 12 are there.
Yeah.
And he's with the crowds. You know, the feeding of the 5,000 is like, there's this group of people that are feeding them. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like, so again, it's about more going, I don't have to, like, figure out some new thing and add a brand new context in my life that is mission. It's going, like, no, how can I integrate my life so I'm not rushing all over the place? And then I can begin to go, actually, I want to eliminate some things from my life. Yeah. Because I want to be available to throw these parties and to be near enough to the 72 that they're seeing my life, and then have the space and time for the 12 and the 3. And if I'm all over the place, I got no time left for that.
Yeah.
So that's always interesting to me. That's kind of a bullseye target. It's like, this helps you center your life into that context and know what to say yes to, what to say no to.
No, it's so good. One other thing that jumps out to me, we really are speaking to everyday disciple makers in their context that they exist in, right? So we're really helping people plant the gospel, identify where they're at so they can, hone in, not be so overwhelmed, you know, take a deep breath, focus on an area. There might be some people that are kind of catalytic outsiders of groups, you know, so I feel like I'm really called to this specific, you know, group of people. Let's just Single moms is one that's come up in our population. I myself am not a single mom.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. So maybe let's make single dads. Let's say it's single dads to erase anything that might be weird as we're thinking through this. So I'm thinking, okay, I want to reach single dads, but I'm not a single dad. It's still helpful to understand settings for us. Like maybe the 72 is finding ministries and networks that exist in the city that have people like this, begin relationship building on a wider level. But you begin to look for those persons of peace that naturally exist in those communities as an outsider. Yeah. But like this is just so helpful and so good for people who are just like, I want to know how to begin. I'm overwhelmed sometimes with the amount of relationships that I could invest in, but don't have yet. Like it's both of those things. Like we're overwhelmed with the amount, but we have almost no relational depth yet with anyone. Like this can be a super helpful practical tool.
Yeah, so hopefully both of these 2 weeks, last week with the Matthew 28 exercise, this week with the relational concentric circles of Jesus, following Jesus in relationship, are helpful. And hopefully we'll be back into the 248.
We'll see.
All right, y'all have a great week.
Peace.